Excellency, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome. I hope everyone had a wonderful holiday and now feel excited for our lecture. My name is Afni and I will be the MC for today's event. Today we have here with us His Excellency Vincent Piquet, Ambassador of the European Union to Indonesia and Brunei Darussalam. Welcome, Ambassador. How are you? All right. Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, today we will be listening from Ambassador Vincent Piquet on EU views on China and EU-China relations. And the discussion will be moderated by Ibu Mega Nisfa Makhroja. She is a lecturer at Universitas Mataram. She holds a master's degree in international peace and conflict studies from Collegium Civitas, Poland. And her research interest lies in the development issues and education policy. Welcome, Ibu Mega. We would also like to welcome all students who are joining us in the Zoom meeting, and I would like to give special recognition to participating students from Universitas Udayana Bali, Universitas Mataram, Universitas Muhammadiyah Mataram, Universitas Negeri Mataram, Universitas Nusa Cendana Kupang, Universitas Hasanuddin Makassar, Universitas Bosowa Makassar, Universitas Samratulangi Manado, and last but not least, Universitas Cendrawasih Jayapura. Welcome everybody, and also thank you to our participants who are tuning in on our YouTube channel. Before we start, as usual, don't forget to share your moment with us from this ambassador lecture by tagging at FPC Indo and at uni_Eropa on your social media posts. Ladies and gentlemen, now without further ado, let us start the discussion. Please welcome the moderator, Ibu Mega. Ibu Mega, the screen is yours now.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Afni. My name is Mega Nisfa Makhroja. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today's webinar. And then it's a very interesting topic since we are really discussing about EU views on China and EU-China relations. So today we have our Ambassador Vincent Piquet as the Ambassador of Indonesia and Brunei Darussalam. Okay, before we start, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to brief introduction about EU and China. Maybe we see it's very interesting topic since the rise of China and then EU-China relation is, we can see it's multifaceted because it's economic cooperation, it's security cooperation, even its development cooperation. So it will be interesting, and we will hear from our ambassador. And then before we start, I would like to introduce a brief introduction about our ambassador. His Excellency Vincent Piquet is the ambassador of Indonesia and Brunei Darussalam since 2019, and then he also have experience as ambassador in Macau and Hong Kong, and then also in Malaysia. So the ambassador very expert about this issue. So you can encourage, you can now ask him about the issues, and it will be interesting discussion. So without any further ado, I will welcome His Excellency Ambassador Vincent Piquet. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Mega Nisfa of the Universitas Mataram, where I visited a year ago on a working visit to Lombok Island, beautiful Lombok Island. I visited the university, also saw companies and some tourism development and some green projects there, very interesting. Very glad to be with you this afternoon and be again the guest of FPCI, the Foreign Policy Community Indonesia. Fantastic outfit with so many students involved throughout Indonesia. And I'm very pleased to hear that there are so many different parts, different provinces participating in today's lecture. Nusa Tenggara Timur, Nusa Tenggara Barat, Southeast Sulawesi, East Sulawesi, North Sulawesi, and Bali, of course, and as well as Papua. So greetings to everybody, wherever you are, from Jakarta, where I sit, as you may see behind me. In Jakarta, that is a bit rainy, but also with some sunshine interspersed. The topic of I greet from FPCI, of course, very particularly the colleagues Afni and Ray, our very trusted partners at the FPCI headquarters. Topic of today, China and the EU-China relations. Fascinating topic, very important topic for anybody. China, important topic for anybody interested in international relations or economic relations today. It's of course a major country, and a country that has put its mark on international relations, international affair, and the international economy over the past 20-30 years. The first time that I really thought about China was quite a while ago. I was a PhD student in the United States, and I lived with a man who was a businessman. He was my landlord, and this was in the mid 1980s, and he at some point he had been on a business trip to China. He was one of the the earlier travelers to China after China's opening up, and he told me on coming back about what his experiences, and it was so absolutely fascinating to me as a young research student to hear about that story, and this distant, faraway country, and at the same time so exciting, so tantalizing in many respects. So it awakened some curiosity on my part, because I never worked on China directly until later in my career with the EU, and my first visit to China was in around about 2005. So that was a good 20 years after my stay in the United States. In 2005, I worked in the EU headquarters in Brussels, and dealing with a number of regional cooperation programs. And in that framework, we organized business matchmaking events and higher education fairs throughout Asia, and including China. And we had events in Beijing and in Chengdu in southwest China. Now, in Chengdu was a city I hadn't heard of before I visited, really. And when I was there, I was told that the city had 10 million people, inhabitants, and that they had built a metro system in the space of 2 years. Very simple system, basically a cross, but there it was in the center of the city, built in the space of 2 years. I was amazed, and I was even more amazed when they told me that Chengdu, 10 million people, if you went up the road a little bit further, you ended up in a city called Chongqing, and 20 million people. Now, when I heard that, then of course it became clear to me that what was happening there in China, and I began to realize the magnitude and the momentum of Chinese developments. And so quite impressed and astounded by it at the same time. And I turn to the next slide, please, now. That second experience was, of course, already an experience of the different China after the opening up and the liberalization to some extent of the Chinese economy. It was already beginning to be a China that would be at the heart of the shift in the center of gravity of the world economy, shift from the Atlantic to the Pacific, a shift that started back then and that has continued up to the very day now. China had, by the year 2005, already joined WTO, and that happened in 2001. It was a conditional accession to the WTO. There were a number of conditions attached to that membership, having to do with the veritable opening up of the Chinese economy that we wish to see before China could participate in the full range of economic rights under the WTO treaty. But there it was, and I saw that grow further, and that economic and political force when I was posted in Hong Kong in 2012, 2016. Hong Kong, the special administrative region of the People's Republic, a very dynamic place that handled back then, and I think still today, the large majority of mainland China's foreign investments internationally. A major financial center, very, very dynamic. And when I was in Hong Kong in 2013, China launched the Belt and Road Initiative. We were all us diplomats invited to the Foreign Affairs Commission in Hong Kong to hear about that when it was just published by the central government in Beijing. Nobody had a clue at that point in time, and I would suspect even the Chinese themselves, how the Belt and Road Initiative would develop in the subsequent decade. And it's now about 10 years old. And we have now come to know the Belt and Road as a almost global initiative. Certainly, if you look at the emerging economies and the developing economies in the world, it was the start of the massive buildup of China's soft power in especially the emerging economies. An initiative that has produced many positive responses, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, in Central Asia, and in some other countries also in Asia. But that over the past couple of years has also become a little bit controversial at times for having led to financial dependencies of the beneficiary countries of China. But nevertheless, there it is, and certainly a factor also for the European Union to take into account. China also attempted to roll out the Belt and Road in a number of our EU member states. Initially, there was interest from about 16 member states, mostly in the Central Eastern European side and in the South. However, at some point, that enthusiasm has tempered because it was felt that the Belt and Road got too much the characteristics of an offensive economic interest and too little of a cooperation interest. Meanwhile, of course, China has continued to grow and grow and grow. It is not at all anymore the producer of cheap labor products, manufactured products, but it's become a technological powerhouse in its own right. It has achieved a historic feat, historic achievement for the world of lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So if you look at it from the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals perspective, this was a major success, and of which China rightfully is very proud. It's an achievement for the world. It has led not only to China's own growth, but also to the economic growth and of other parts of Asia as well as of the world. Made possible, of course, by this revolutionary initiative of the Chinese leadership at the time, and combined also with a recognition that private sector or market-driven entrepreneurism was a better answer for economic development than centrally led economies. There are, of course, nuances to be made there, as we know, but that's neither here nor there about the very important achievement that was realized. That happened in China itself. In the meantime, of course, also the EU economic relationship with China grew very fast and very positively, and by and large, and leading to a situation now where we have a tremendously important trade relationship with China, with a good 800 billion euros worth of trade between us and China last year. So that is about 2.5 billion euros of trade per day. Massive. And with, at the same time, and that I come back to that later on, a important imbalance in this trade relation. There's a very strong surplus for China in the trade relation, a surplus that has doubled over the past 2 years of during and after COVID. I'll come back to that in a second. The rising political power of China has gone hand in hand with that economic growth, in power in the region, but also power, of course, around the globe. Not just the soft power of the Belt and Road Initiative, but also the harder power based on the military strength, growing military strength of China. And the last point of backdrop that I should mention is that, of course, today it is impossible to address global issues without involving or recognizing the role of China. It's impossible to solve issues relating to the global public goods without the contribution from China and without China having a strong place in the development of such global goods. So that's the backdrop. And we turn to the next slide. But context, this refers to where we are more or less now. First of all, just a couple of elements. First of all, this phrase the happy globalization, it's over. Many of us grew up with the notion that growing links trade links, political links, but especially economic links between countries was good for us, for our growth, for our wealth, for our job creation, and so on. It was considered that liberalization would continue to produce benefits for everybody. That phase of the happy globalization is, I think, very much over. It doesn't mean that globalization is no longer there. No, of course not. We are in an interconnected world where trade will continue to go all across the globe, whether it's end products or whether it is supplies and half products for the final products that we buy in the shops. But it is that will continue. But there is a recognition that in some respects we have become too intertwined and as a result too vulnerable for our resilience as independent countries, as independent and sovereign regions. So that is a factor that certainly colors and affects our appreciation, our assessment of relations with China at the present moment. Secondly, the shock of COVID. We all remember that in the very early days, the COVID shock was of course very, very massive. And it was an economic shock where all of a sudden travel and transport came to a virtual standstill for some time. Diplomatic missions like mine and the EU member state embassies had to find planes to fly tourists stranded in Bali back home in Europe, and the same happened to the trade flows. So an economic shock, a logistical shock, and a supply chain shock happened. We had also a situation in China where the authorities resorted to a very extreme, some people would say, policy on COVID, of a virtual lockup, not of parts of the country, but of the entirety of China, a lockdown in the face of COVID. And there have been, as a result, for a period of a good 2.5 years, extremely few person-to-person contacts between China and the rest of the world. And that sounds like nothing much, but if you really think that through, then of course this is a very big thing. If you can't travel mutually to your respective partners' countries for doing business, for new investments, for educational exchanges, for tourism, then of course a big element of the people-to-people of the political relations between countries drops away. And we're suffering from that a little bit, also because in the meantime, of course, the Chinese authorities developed economic policy responses that highlighted self-reliance rather than engagement with foreign economic partners. And as a result, there are, you can say, there are, as a result of COVID, lasting economic changes and lasting changes in the economic relations between China and its main foreign partners, including the European Union. So now China has opened up, and very much, of course, welcome in the interest of renewing these normal contacts, people to people, political, economic, tourism that we used to have. The next context point is the shock of war in Europe. Won't elaborate on this, but just cannot stress enough how fundamental this shock is for us Europeans, for a peaceful continent for 70 years, to be faced with a major war on our doorstep in a country, Ukraine, that borders on 4 of our member states, a war waged by a country, Russia, that borders on another 4 or 5, depending on how you count, member states of the European Union. This is very real for us. And I was in Europe just 2 weeks ago, and you feel it, and you see it in the street, that this is happening now. And we are not by far at a situation where the shock of that war is absorbed. We are still suffering from the remainder of the energy crisis. We have come out of that very much, but still there is the awareness of it in our minds, as also the food crisis, the food price crisis, I should say. And there too, of course, what has it highlighted in Europe? The fact that we used to be, until recently, over-dependent on Russia in terms of our energy supplies. That's finished now, but it has raised an awareness of the need to look more critically in general about our economic dependencies with foreign partners and our economic vulnerabilities and political vulnerability as a result. That's what I mean by the shock of dependency. And the shock of the dependency of Russian gas is certainly something that is now being has translated into an assessment, a reassessment of dependencies in a more general term. I mentioned there the China-US relations, and I do that because whether you sit in Europe or whether you sit in Indonesia, this is a factor of our political life. This is a fact of our the international relations around the globe, and regardless of where you stand in the rivalry between China and the US, a rivalry there is, and a rivalry means that directly or indirectly one is confronted with choices. With options that need to take into account how best to place yourself in such a situation. Some people say it is necessary to choose between partners in this rivalry, choose China over the US or choose the US over China. Others will say you have to navigate your own course and in that rivalry find the best way forward for your own interests, maintaining the doors open for relations with both superpowers. And that, I think, is in a way what I mean with the last bullet there, the EU Indo-Pacific strategy. It's a strategy that reflects 2 things. First of all, the sheer fact that the Indo-Pacific, and particularly East Asia, but also South Asia, are now very much the economic center of center of gravity in the global economy, and that there also there's a political dimension to that. And as European Union, as member states of the European Union, you need to respond to that. And the second thing is that I want to stress is that the Indo-Pacific strategy, of course, is a strategy that for us needs to involve China. There is no 2 ways about it, that China has its place in Asia and that we need to work with China wherever and whenever we can. And precisely what that is a little bit under discussion inside the EU and also in China. But this is a process that will have to be resolved over the coming years through further diplomatic and economic engagement. Next slide, please. How does the EU see China? I'll be very brief on this. This is all readable in papers, and particularly our 2019 policy paper on China, the EU-China Strategic Outlook. And the key thing that paper said, talked about, was the evolution that we have seen in the economic and political relations with China, with a China that had become and still becoming more assertive in projecting its geopolitical strength and economic strength around the globe, including in Europe. And that translates itself in policies from China in all areas: political, multilateral, bilateral, human rights, democracy, but also in the economy. And finally, of course, in the global goods dimension. And here we have this three-pronged approach towards China. One as a partner for cooperation, for negotiation. Cooperation is evident in areas like the economy, but also in topics like the more sectoral policies, whether it's environment or climate or education or customs and so on, and also for negotiation in topics relating to trade and investment. However, that is conditioned by the fact that in many areas, of course, Chinese firms and the Chinese economy as a whole is an economic competitor for us and as for others. There's nothing wrong with that, with competition. We believe in competition. We have an open economy as European Union, one of the most open economies in the world. But of course, it presupposes fair trade, and it presupposes fair competition. It presupposes equitable access to both markets reciprocally, and that is where the things are, in our assessment, out of sync at present, leading to this tremendous trade deficit of the European Union with China. But an economic competitor relationship is very much a part of that. And lastly, this systemic rival. It's a fact that the way we approach governance in Europe is radically different from the Chinese way of doing the same. It is a rivalry here that translates itself in, of course, lack of agreement on some of the more fundamental problems on human rights and rule of law. That also translates itself in a competition at the global level for which political governance system is best, and the promotion of our respective economic and political governance systems mutually at the expense of the other. It's not a win-win situation, but a zero-sum game in many respects. So that is something we need to face up to, and for which we at present have no immediate solution other than that to say, from the EU's position, we will always speak out for what we believe in, and we will oppose actions in the human rights area, democracy, that we disagree with in China in a very transparent way. We will oppose also revisions of the multilateral order that are not based on notions of equitability and respect like they were ingrained in the UN Charter. So that's very much something on our minds at present as well. But unlike tendencies within the US policy towards China, we don't believe in decoupling our economy from China, but rather to look at the vulnerabilities that we have in our economic relations as a result of over-dependencies. So it's about looking at the risks. Where are the risks for us, for the EU, in our relations with China, and to deal with such risk and in order to protect ourselves. So de-risking rather than decoupling, and that will, in all probability, involve a rebalancing of our relations that is, for us, based very much on transparency, on predictability, and also on reciprocity. Next slide, please. A couple of more topical issues in our relations that here, and these are, in some, I don't need to elaborate each and every one of them so much, but I think these are very much expressions of the sort of systemic rivalry, of the systemic rivalry that I described earlier on. And we have that in the economic sphere. We have where the EU, in order to protect its security interests, has taken some measures to against economic and investment decisions by China and in Europe, and those measures, of course, we think they're utterly necessary and reasonable. China, of course, is very much against them and has had a rather strong response to them, disproportionate response in our respect. This also relates our single market. Our single market, 27 countries, one single market, one economic, social, tariff, commercial, etc. policy, and with free movement of goods, services, people, and capital amongst them. China has broken part of that integrity of the single market by targeting one of our member states, Lithuania, with economic sanctions. And the reason was that Lithuania has allowed the opening of an economic representation office in Lithuania, in Vilnius, for Taiwan. And it's politically sensitive, of course, for China, but the reaction of China was way beyond what is proportionate in our respect, and we fundamentally disagree with singling out one member state, which at the end of the day impacts us all. Very topical is, of course, the Chinese position on the Russian war against Ukraine. I've described to you the reality and the strong reality of that war for us, and the way this bites into our political and economic security all across Europe. China has refrained from any criticism of Russia for its action. It has rather sided with Russia by saying, particularly, of course, during the visit by the Chinese president to Moscow, repeating that Russia is and China have a partnership without limits. Now, that is something that we cannot understand and cannot agree and we are strongly of the view that China, if it, as it says, respects the UN Charter's fundamental tenets of the inviolability of borders, of the principles of sovereignty and of peaceful relations, then China must do something about stopping this war and bringing Russia to its senses. That's literally how our president has put it. China should bring Russia to reason. And we don't see this now yet. Possibly the telephone contact between the Ukrainian president and the Chinese president 2 weeks ago could be the start of something of an engagement by China for an equitable peace for Ukraine. And the last big topic, a geostrategic topic, is of course the tensions in the Taiwan Strait, where two things I should say. First of all, the EU adheres consistently to the One China policy. One China. Secondly, the EU insists that any change in the governance of Taiwan should be a peaceful one and should not one that is enforced in military or other coercive ways. So this is a very delicate and also geostrategically weighty issue, definitely, that we are very concerned about, and that certainly at the present moment also weighs on our relations between us and China. But the other thing I should say, and I'm partly repeating what I said earlier on, that we continue to be committed to cooperation with China and in the Indo-Pacific, but also bilaterally. And we very much recognize China's crucial role in solving global and regional problems. Next slide, please. Here, further elaboration of some of the main topics between us and China. One is the vision topic, the different visions that we have on these topics like human rights, fundamental rights, but also on the market economy, free trade, and principles of fairness in that, in the trade relations. We see there's an imbalance here, and that particularly, and that is the second bullet, results in this very unbalanced economic relations and economic security between us and China. 400 billion euros deficit last year, which was double the deficit of the year before. Untenable in the long run, needs to change. Can be changed simply by China giving us a fair access to its market for goods, for trade, but also for investment. And we have not seen that coming through yet. Another key worry for us is the subsidization of China's economy and of the state-owned companies of China, state-owned companies that come to Europe to buy assets, to purchase companies. And of course, this is not a fair game. If you are a subsidized partner, you can outcompete easily others who come to the market without a subsidy. So this is a major worry of ours, especially because we saw that Chinese state-owned firms came to buy up strategic assets in our economies, companies with high tech, and also companies in the logistical sectors, the critical infrastructure like ports and railway systems. So here we have a major worry on our hands that is not quickly resolved unless China changes the parameters of its economic engagement policies. It also relates to the problems that our companies, and also Indonesian companies, by the way, face when they enter China. Companies are obliged, foreign companies are obliged to work together with the Chinese intelligence and security services in gathering information, and are not allowed to reveal any information about that outside the firms. And secondly, there are these practices of forced technology transfer for any company that invests in China and partners with Chinese firms. Partnering is fine, but if it comes down to forced technology transfer, then of course we are vehemently opposed to that. And this is not just a self-interest of ours, but also our argumentation is that it will simply hinder the investment decisions of European companies, who of course will think twice about investment if it means giving up some of their technology for nothing. We have a technology issue, of course, also particularly relating to the microchips and artificial intelligence, where we feel that the partnership is not two ways with China, but it is one way. And for that reason, we have to protect ourselves to make sure that we're not selling out on strategic technologies to Chinese firms and to China that later on outcompete us. Last very important point is about raw materials. And here, of course, we come to something that relates also to the green transition, the energy transition that the EU has embarked on. We know that what we want to achieve, a very tough challenge in Europe, and with raising to almost 40% our renewable energy share in our energy mix by the year 2030. That's only 7 years from now. And we know that to do that, we need lithium, we need cobalt, and particular magnesium and rare earths, materials that where China has a very strong dominance on the world market. So in other words, we have a major vulnerability here to potential economic coercion. And clearly, this is something we don't like, and we want to get away from by boosting our capacity domestically inside Europe. Okay, the third point there, Russia's war against Ukraine, I have already talked about that, so I'll skip that here. But it is part of the three key issues in our discussions at present. Next slide, please. Yeah, cooperation. This is the more positive agenda, and this is very much the discussion about multilateral public goods, where we have all found quite consistently a very positive engagement with China, and we're very appreciative of that. Climate change is one. The biodiversity convention that China chaired in late last year and leading to a new agreement. Multilateral agreement is a second. There was also the multilateral agreement on the oceans, with China very positively supported, and we are very grateful for that. There is Another area is more economic, and that is the financial position and problems of the least developed countries. Now, these countries were indebted already, of course, but COVID has given them a tremendous blow in their to their economic growth, and has added lots of debt to their books. So we have to do something here as international community, as the middle income and rich countries, which the EU is willing to do, but also it requires the cooperation with China on this, which of course also has major loans outstanding in the least developed countries. Pandemics, resilience, and preparedness is something that we also wish to work on with China in the framework of this new international treaty, in the framework of the pandemic fund, which was agreed at the G20 summit in Bali under Indonesian presidency last year. And so that this is a vital interest of China and ours, on which we can collaborate. And lastly is more difficult, of course. It has to do with the fact that the multilateral order that was created shortly after the Second World War was excellent, but of course is showing the signs of the times to some extent, and has not been amended ever since to reflect the different power balances that we see in the world, and the rise of the emerging economies, and China is of course number one there. So this is a discussion we need to have with everybody, but particularly of course with China and India, as well as Indonesia, as the three big Asian partners. Discussion how to take that forward in a very difficult and complex political context at global level. China has put forward a number of new initiatives in that regard, and the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and a Global Civilizational Initiative. We're still studying it, and these three ideas a little bit the sense that they are, in terms of their spirit or their motivation, are mostly an attempt to project China's vision of the world, rather than an attempt to find a new equilibrium between the various interests in the world that we need to see if we want to move forward towards a reform of the multilateral and update of the multilateral order. Okay, next slide, please. It's a bit hard to read for me now. This image is very blurry. I don't know if it's the same for you, but here are a couple of the diplomatic initiatives that we are working on in order to de-risk our relations. I have alluded to some of the specifics already in the previous preceding discussion, but very much we have an interest in strengthening the international system and to work together with China on that for the sake of global issues, but also for working out a stronger multilateral order, and that is needed for political and security reasons, but also it is needed for economic reasons. Everybody says and realizes, recognizes that the WTO isn't functioning well enough, and we have to improve that, strengthen that international framework in order to have a better framework for global economic and political and security policy. Principle from us is very much to promote diplomacy for stability, for communication with China. We want to create a greater space for a more ambitious partnership. We are not realizing enough at the present moment. We're a bit stuck. We're in a stalemate situation, and we need to create the space for moving forward out of that. Competition, economic competition, has to be become fairer and more disciplined, and we have to abide by the rules that we preach in Geneva at the WTO and bilaterally, and in order to help investment and trade in a better way. And lastly, communication is needed and continues to be needed about the sensitive issues between us, whether it's human rights or geostrategic, the South China Sea and or the Taiwan Straits. Next slide, please. That's the last slide. That's more the economic side of the de-risking. Part of it has to do with developing in Europe what we have outsourced to other parts of the world. So we need to develop a greater microchip capacity. We need to develop a raw materials capacity and a battery capacity to a much greater extent than we have right now. This sounds like a pipe dream, but I can tell you it is not. There is already in the past couple of years, we've moved forward a lot about in the batteries and in the microchips, and we have reason to think that this can be successful. It doesn't mean that we will want to close our markets and become isolationist. No, it doesn't mean that, but it does mean that we realize that in order to have fair and resilient trade relations with the world, we need to have a stronger basis back home than we have presently. So the other bullets there are reflections of that. We have some new trade tools to protect ourselves in critical trade sectors, and also we have some new tools to protect ourselves against unfair competition from subsidized firms. And we have China in mind particularly, but of course it also concerns other countries. And lastly, it's about the supply chain. In Indonesia, we have similar things, of course, about diversification, trade and supply chain resilience. What applies to you, it also applies to Europe. So this is another big topic of the transition that we're working on very, very hard right now. And I link this particularly to the relations between European Union and Indonesia. And it is without a doubt that the big free trade agreement that Indonesia and us are negotiating, the CEPA agreement, is very much part of broadening and strengthening our supply chains and part of the diversification of trade and investment relations between the European Union and Asia. And that CEPA negotiation is seeing a new momentum at the moment, and that is thanks to the meeting between President Widodo and European Union Commission President von der Leyen in Bali last November. And they agreed that we should conclude the CHEPA free trade talks this year, 2023. And I am very hopeful that that indeed can be realized in the coming months towards a very good result for both sides. Win-win, not zero-sum. I stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. Such as interesting and brightful insight for us that you mentioned about how EU-China relations, also how you respond toward Russia-Ukrainian conflict during the China involved, and then the issues of climate change and etc. And then now we have 3 questions for our student. And then I would like to invite the first student from University of Mataram, Nona Namira Najwa, who asked this question. Please, you can ask directly to the ambassador about your question. Nona Namira Najwa, do you hear me? Okay, I think there is an error or something about Namira connection. So Nona Namira asking about, with the current state, how do you see the EU and China relations in 5 years? That's the first question, Ambassador. Do you want to answer, or we have a 3 question for 3 students, or we will for the next 3?
You take the 3, please.
Okay, and the second from Subhan Adam Ahirullah. Adam is here from University of Mataram. Adam, okay. And then the last one is Wan Nur Ain from Universitas Bosowa. Wan Nur, okay. Maybe the third student is not here, but I will read the question. The first, Namira, with the current state, how do you see the EU and China relation in 5 years? And Adam asked about what challenge and the opportunity does the EU face in balancing its economic ties with China, with concern over issues such as intellectual property and security threat posed by China technology company. And then the third one is from Wan Nur Ain from University of Bosowa. We know that the EU and China are cooperating in manufacturing industry and the technology to achieve carbon emission target and strengthen a safer and more sustainable energy system. And then this cooperation is also carried out by passing of the net zero industry act by the EU. What is the basis of the EU to decide to cooperate with China in terms of handling the climate and energy crisis, while China itself until now continues to hold the title of the world's largest carbon emitter? Okay, and then please, Ambassador, time is yours.
Yeah, these are all 3 very good questions, and not easy ones. And I would be happy if we sat in a lecture room. Then it would have been great to have a roundtable discussion about it. It's a bit difficult here, but but what in 5 years? 5 years is 2028, and we will be running close to the end, the target year for the Paris Accord. Of course, well, all of us have committed to have realized very important CO2 emission cuts. For us, it's 55%. For China, I don't know exactly, but also ambitious. So that is one thing that will be very much on our minds towards that time in the climate area. In terms of our bilateral economic relations, I do think that in 5 years' time, we must have resolved some of the major problems that we have in our imbalance in our trade relations. And that is you may say that we are saying that only because we have such a large trade deficit with China. So what we're saying is sheer self-interest, but it's not true. We have a trade deficit with Indonesia too, but there's very simple and objective reasons for that, and that's to do with your important raw commodities exports, palm oil in particular, and timber, and to the EU. And so we have no issue with that. But in the case of China, of course, we have a number of structural protectionist problems in the relationship from the Chinese side that hinder the natural development of our economic relations. So I hope that in 5 years' time, we will have come to some sort of consensus about how to deal with that, and that we will have come to some more equitability in the trade relation, and that we also have come to a greater respect for the principles of the marketplace. And the marketplaces have to be open, of course, but they also have to respect the property of your partner. In other words, we cannot accept a situation where we see that European companies are unfairly forced to give up part of their technology to Chinese firms when they invest in there. We cannot accept that we see a very targeted policy of China through state-owned companies targeting our critical infrastructure in Europe. So this is not an investment as such, a development investment, but this is a strategic political investment, and that is, of course, something we cannot accept. And so that, I think, in the economy and trade. Politically, that's a very important question, of course. China's development over the past 10 years since Xi Jinping has been in power has been one internationally of greater assertiveness and much greater in some respects. Now, will that change? If you read most observers, most commentators after the latest party congress in Beijing, I don't think that the observers and the analysts say it will change much for as long as Xi Jinping will be having this role. So that is, we have to work hard through diplomacy to stay engaged with China, but also be very open-eyed and about the challenge that we have in striking a political consensus of partnership, of respect for the international norms of sovereignty and respect for the international order in the full sense, not in a self-seeking sense. Self-serving sense from China. So that will be a very, very tough task. The second question from Adam. I've touched on some of it already. You referred to intellectual property. This is very sensitive indeed to us. We own a lot of intellectual property, and we see it disappear unfairly to Chinese competitors. This is not something that nobody can accept or should accept, of course, and we have to deal with this. We're not talking about the copying of consumer goods, which is bad, of course. It shouldn't happen. It's not allowed. But we're here talking about the illegal procurement of sensitive technology, the microchips and related technology developed by us and disappearing into Chinese hands. So that is, as I said early on, we believe in open markets and fair trade, but one of the premises is, of course, that you have also respect for the same norms and standards, and respect for the property of the other side. And that is very important for us. And that's something we will have to pursue for balanced economic relations with China. And that also applies to the third question. I didn't catch the name of the person who asked the third question about collaborating with China on the global climate agenda, while at the same time China is the world's largest emitter of CO2. That's true. That it shows you so very, in such simple and stark terms, the challenge that we're up against as world community. This is not finger pointing to China alone, but as the world community, and we have to make that transition towards low carbon and carbon neutral, while continuing the growth agenda, the poverty reduction agenda at the same time. And China is moving fast on cutting CO2 in many areas. It knows very well what industrial emissions mean in urban centers. Beijing is repeatedly suffering from tremendous problems of air pollution, and so we can certainly say that the awareness of China of the need for action has grown tremendously over the past decade. Translating such awareness into action, consistent action, is of course the next step, and we are still in that phase. So we have, as on the whole, seen a positive partnership with China on the global climate agenda. That encourages us that China is partnering at global level in this agenda, and that we have reason to be moderately, cautiously optimistic about China playing its role and making the right contribution from its side. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Great. So sometimes it's different to say how China-EU relation, and for the very sensitive issues, sometimes we can summarize that maybe the relationship between China and EU is quite like more frenemy. Like in one side they have a competition, in the other side there must be cooperation. And then we also have 2 questions here from student, and then one in the chat box. And then the first question from Farida Prastika, who raised her hand. And please, Farida, unmute your microphone and ask your question. Unmute your mic, please. Okay.
Hello, good morning. Sorry, good afternoon, Mr. Ambassador and Miss. Sorry for my internet connection. My name is Farida Harlia Prastika. I would like to ask one question or two related to European Union relation with China. First, I want to ask, how was the European Union's balance its economic interests with its strategic concern in its approach to China's trade measures that impact the European Union's single market? And second, I want to ask about what step has the European Union taken to ensure that impact the European Union single market. What step has the European Union taken to ensure that its economic interests don't come at the expense of its strategic priorities?
Okay, thank you, Prastika, for your questions. And then we also have Reza Atmaji for his question. Please unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Kok nggak bisa unmute ini? Oh ya, good afternoon, sir, Mr. Vincent. I have question about China and Europe. Yes. A question to me: can the power of cooperation between two countries, such as China and Russia, represent a system of economic power, security, so that every country in the world becomes a peaceful country? Thank you.
Thank you, Reza, for your question. And then one more question from the chat box, Ambassador from Ihyar Wahyudi, University of Posoa. What is Europe's response to the emerging force of BRICS, and what extent has the EU been involved? Okay, there are three questions. Please, for the answering the question. Thank you.
Thanks very much. First of all, to reply to the question from Farida about the China's measures against the EU's internal market, or particularly against one member states and impacting the internal market. You know, it is very fundamental for us. Compare it with a country taking measures, punitive measures against a single province or in one island of Indonesia because of something that was said or done there, and basically a measure that suggests that the foreign country does not recognize the integrity of your sovereignty. Now that is what's happening to us right now, with China blocking trade relations and trade to and from Lithuania. Now, Lithuania may be a relatively small country, but Lithuania is one of the 27 member states and a sovereign country within a sovereign European Union, and totally part of a single market. So if you target one country, then you target the whole of the single market at the same time. We don't accept that. And we, in other words, resist completely in any such measure. Not played up, of course. We have no interest in a trade war, but we will insist that a normal trade relation and a normalization of the trade is necessary if we want to develop our partnership further. Our partnership right now has a very difficult phase. There's, in some respects, a stalemate, also in the trade and the economic relations. The draft agreement for comprehensive agreement on investment is stuck for political reasons. And we would like to unblock it, and I think China would, in principle, like to have it, but right now we feel we have to, we cannot move forward for the reasons of China's measures against us. So our strategic priority of getting closer to China is momentarily not moving forward a lot, pending the resolution of this and other specific trade differences. The question from Rezo. Not sure if I understood it completely correctly, but it was about whether or not the partnership between China and Russia could be a factor for restoring peace in Europe and a peaceful international order. Well, right now it doesn't look like it. Let's put it like that. Simple fact is that Russia is a member of the UN Security Council, permanent member, and it's fighting a war as a sovereign country without any provocation. It's unjustified, illegitimate by any standard. 141 UN members have said so in 3 votes. So Russia is not a force for peace at the moment. It's a force for war. And secondly, of course, China's relationship with Russia, if anything, it has intensified over the past period since the war started. And that partnership, of course, is for us very difficult to reconcile with China being a force for a positive, peaceful resolution of this unjustified war. And so China came forward with a peace plan. It was not much of a plan. It was more a set of principles, some statements. But there was one very fundamental thing missing from that plan, and that is the restoration of sovereignty over parts of Ukraine that were illegally taken by Russia. Now, who can accept that? Which sovereign country can accept such a plan? So we find it very hard to see that that plan as in a realistic picture of capable of bringing peace back to that part of Europe. So we need to move forward on that. China needs to move forward on that in our respect. Walk the talk. In other words, not just say you believe in peace and sovereignty and the integrity of national borders, but also apply that to this concrete situation we have in Europe of a country that has at the moment 15% of its territory occupied by foreign forces, military forces. So walk the talk on that point is something that we hope China will. And we hope that the contact President Xi Jinping has had with President Zelensky has maybe opened something of a movement there, but we have to wait and see, basically, to see if that can happen or will happen. Last question from Itia. How do we view the BRICS initiative? And are we involved in it? No, we're not involved in it. We're not a BRIC. And how do we see it? The BRICS, I think, are a platform that are no doubt important for dialogue and for comparing notes on development and economically and for comparing political notes, political assessment of the global security and etc. For discussing possibly multilateral things, positioning for UN reform and so on. Maybe the BRICS can make a role, make a contribution there. Will the BRICS ever be an operational body, an economic union, or somebody floated the currency union? I don't know. For the time being, I fail to see that this is realistic, that this can move, that there is sufficient common basis, common interests between the BRICS to make this work, and that there are probably more relevant platforms for the individual BRICS available. For instance, if you look at India and China, in Asia, there's so much more commonality of interests with countries inside the region, with ASEAN, and within the larger the RCEP grouping and so on. And I don't see that the BRICS can be a complementary, a viable complementary or better framework for cooperation between them than other platforms that exist. Same for a country like Brazil in South America or South Africa in Africa.
Thank you, Ambassador. So maybe that is the last question and answer session today, because our limited time. And then I would like to wrap up about the discussion today. As we know, the first, like we saw that China transition since 1980s, growing up into one of the big economics in the world, and then China as the second largest trading partner of EU. That's why EU and China have a very engaged relationship in economic. But in the other hand, EU and China also have complex relations in the human rights issues, climate change, and then the issues of economic balance. However, China also involved in other issues such as Russian-Ukraine war, and then it's also affected EU, and then China complex relation with US as well. But in this discussion, we would like to see how EU position in its relationship with China. So it will be interesting to see how EU define its strategy toward China, to the risking through the diplomacy, how EU strengthen in international collaboration system, diplomatic stability, more transparency, and making competitive fair in the such as like single market. And then one of the most important thing that China and EU have to create more or deepening collaboration, such as in EU Indo-Pacific strategy, how EU also involving China in the development project in the world, such as in the third world, in Asia, Southeast Asia, and then we hope also as well in Indonesia, because with the China power, China also have great power to also involve in the EU vision to create the peaceful and well the world with its democracy idea. And then thank you for all of the question, very interesting question. And then for the ambassador, it's very great insight for us today. And then we will meet in the next session. And then I will hand over the session to the MC. Thank you for everyone who participate in this discussion. And then I will hand over to Ms. Afni.
Thank you, Ambassador Piken, for the insightful lecture. And I hope every student joining the session today could learn a lot from Ambassador Piken's presentation. And thank you also to Ibu Mega for moderating the session. And now let's take a group picture. I would like to invite everybody to turn on your camera and give your background for some documentation. And if you're lucky, your picture will be in Ambassador Piken's Twitter post. Okay, are we good?
There we go.
Right.
Don't forget to follow Dubes Uni Eropa on Twitter.
Yes.
Yes.
So in 3, 2, 1. Once again. 1, 2, 3. Last one. 1, 2, 3. All right. With that, we have come to the end of our lecture today. Thank you everybody for joining. Thank you Ambassador Pikat, Ibu Mega, and see you in our next lecture.
Terima kasih banyak and greetings to everybody.
Sure, Ambassador Pikat.
Thanks for
Bye.
joining in today.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your time, and thank you for all the students who are tuning in today.